All right, God bless y'all. Um, Figured I'd go ahead and make a video just talking about probably this time of year, in my opinion, one of the top baits that's going to produce fish for you. And because it usually does produce for me. I hadn't fished them for a year or two, but if you have a lake that is a grassy lake or it has a lot of stumps, fishing pressure has become anymore very, very obvious when you go to the lake. When you used to be, everybody worked Monday through Friday off the weekends. If you were off Saturday and Sunday at your local lake, you, of course, I mean, you ran into a lot of fishermen. Unfortunately, in a lot of lakes, if you're off Saturday, which everybody gets to be off Saturday, now you're running into a bigger problem just about every lake you go to, and that's that there's a tournament at every lake. Don't get me wrong, if you're a fisherman that fishes those tournaments, to you that's awesome because you like to go fish those tournaments. But if you're an everyday just fisherman who just wants to go out and enjoy bass fishing on the weekends, then it's a challenge, because unless you're close to a bigger lake, you know, like Cumberland, for example, then you can pretty much find somewhere on that lake that you can fish and enjoy the day and not be up against everybody in town. But if you fish a smaller lake, then it becomes a big challenge. You know, it becomes definitely something that you face and an obstacle that you have, because every bank's going to have somebody on it. So the days of all of us just fishing the same little thing, to be honest with you, I think that's why a lot of times a lot of the regular baits that we throw every day, we don't think about it, but that may be why they're not working as good. And that's because that may be a bait that everybody uses. So if you go to a place that has a lot of timber and has a lot of grass, there's a good chance that they're going to see a lot of spinner baits. They're going to see a lot of buzz baits, depending on the time of year, and they're going to see a lot of jigs. Maybe a lot of soft plastics, because a lot of people that don't understand a jig or don't fish a jig fish soft plastics. So then how do I get a bite? Well, the biggest popularity that's come along is a lot of people like throwing that chatterbait. And that catches a lot of fish. I see a lot of people catching fish on it. I personally don't catch very many fish on it, but a lot of people do. The only problem with that bait is, and I'm fine with everybody throwing it, but the reason I'm fine with it is because it won't come through a lot of things. You can fish in a lot of open areas, but a lot of closed areas it doesn't do very well. But one of the baits that I found several years back, due to a technique that I was already doing for several years, but then I realized there were jigs that were specifically designed for this technique, was a swim jig. One that literally the head on the bait, which is the ones that I use, and there's nothing special about them. You can get these just about anywhere. Okay, so the head on this bait is more of a pointed shape. We're just going to talk about them just for a little bit. They kind of have, most of the time, some type of bait fish colors. Seem to be the ones that I do the most about. I will tell you this, there's three colors that I usually use in swim jigs. I like a white with some type of chartreuse on it. I like a bluegill color, which that's what this one is here, just a regular blue color paddle. And I like a black and blue. And just so that there's no confusion about, well, does he make his own, which ones does he use, I go to the store and I just buy these right here. This is what I've been using. Okay, that's just a Strike King Hack Attack heavy cover swim jig. Okay, there's nothing fancy, nothing special. Everybody grabs these. You can grab them just about at every store. Okay, my preference is the 3/8. Years ago, I used to use the quarters, and the quarters are okay. But what I found out with was when this is most effective to me is when the water has a little bit of color to it. And it's also a little more effective to me in the summer. In the summer, I run into fish are a little bit deeper. I throw it on days that are windier. So that 3/8 to me winds up the perfect. What you're going to see on a lot of videos all throughout YouTube is that 90% of the people like the 1/4. They like the 1/4 because they can keep it on that high, and it sinks super slow, and they'll give you all these reasons. Well, the reason I like the 3/8 is because after I put my little plastic on it, it probably weighs closer to a 1/2 ounce, and it's super easy to cast. And while I'm reeling it back to me, I don't have problems keeping this. I don't want it on top. If I wanted it on top, I would throw a topwater. I want this about 3 foot deep, okay? A lot of times I want this about 5 foot deep. I use the same principle that the guys used 2 years ago. Is just barely out of sight to me is when it's most dangerous. That's just the way I feel about it. We're going to take one of these jigs right here before I start talking about anything else, and we're going to say, okay, then one of the things that you see people talk about is, okay, so do you use it just like it is out of the package? I'm going to tell you, no, I don't. Okay. First thing I do with these swim jigs, with these Strike Kingdoms, as soon as I get it, okay, is you see these little eyeballs on the side of it. I go ahead and take my fingernail and I go ahead and get them out of the way. I just take them straight off. See? Now there's nothing in their eyeballs. You say, well, why in the world would you do that? Doesn't it make a difference? Do you see how easy that was to come off? You know what that does right there to a bass? A bass is not worried about those eyeballs being on that bait. Okay, I'm just going to tell you. I've caught enough fish with a swim jig. I used to make my own. Now I don't, just because it's just not worth all the hassle, the shipping and everything else. Plus, I'm going to tell you a little secret. You don't need a whole boatload of these if you use these the right way. If you use these jigs right here as like they're meant to be used, very rarely will you ever lose one. Very rarely do I have this little jig right here deeper than 10 foot. I do 10-15% of the time. I may let this bait go a little bit deeper, but I'm going to show you one little trick that you see everybody talk about. First thing you see people do with their swim jigs is the first thing they're going to start talking to you about is all that weed guard. You see that profile right there? It doesn't have a very good profile. Let me tell you something right there. What I do with that swim jig is I don't touch it. I don't bother that weed guard. You say, well, everybody else cuts it down because it gives it a better hook set. Yes, it does. Let me explain to you something about a swim jig. A swim jig is designed so that you throw it into the cover, thickest cover, just like you would a spinnerbait. This right here is what protects you from getting hung up on this hook, okay? This weed guard here would be, in my opinion, a medium weed guard. You see how I just barely run my, now the hard thing is it's hard for me to explain to you how hard I'm pressing. But all I'm doing is I'm just barely pressing on that, okay? And I can get down to that right there, no problem. Okay, so I'm not concerned. I've caught little fish on this. I've caught 4-pounders on this. I've caught 5-pounders on this. I've caught 3-pounders on this. And I don't bother that weed guard. Why? Because 99% of the time I'm throwing this where most people don't want to throw their Texas rig worm. I'm throwing this back underneath trees that I can't see what's underneath it. I'm throwing this on overhanging limbs. I'm throwing it back in underneath boat docks. I'm literally throwing this little swim jig right here in places that people would not want to throw their Texas rig. And I'm purposely doing it because I'm trying to reach fish that nobody else is casting to. So I don't want to touch that weed guard. If I was going to trim this weed guard like you see most of those guys do, to where they cut it at a 45 and they trim it, you might as well take your pair of pliers, come all the way up here to the top, grab this with a pair of pliers, this weed guard, and just rip it out. If you're going to do that, just rip it out. Why? Because all you're going to do is fight yourself constantly hanging up this jig everywhere you go to cast it. So I'm telling you, years ago, I had 4 or 5 swim jigs, and the first thing I did with them is, oh man, that guy on TV said to trim this. I trimmed every one of them. I went to the lake and started fishing. About a month's time, I'd lost every one of those jigs. From then on, I quit doing that. Why? Because I thought to myself, well, the whole purpose of the weed guard is to keep it from getting the weeds all over it and keeping getting stuff all over it. I just messed it up. And I didn't realize you could order these and put new weed guards in, or I would have done it back then, okay? Number 2, everybody talks about the jig skirt. Everybody sits there, flips it over, does all this kind of stuff for their skirts. Let me show you what I do. Here's what I do. Here's the exact same one with a different trailer on it. I want you to watch something here. This little skirt right here, this is the most important thing about these skirts and what levels you cut them. If the skirt hangs down and interferes with the action of my trailer, then I want to raise it up just a little bit so that it doesn't do that, okay? Now, if I was going to throw this with, say, this right here, see how this has this rage? This is just an average size regimentus. See, it doesn't interfere with the action of that regimentus, does it? That flaps, goes no problem. So I wouldn't have to cut that skirt, okay? If I'm going to throw this little bait right here, this is a rage bug. If I'm going to throw it on this, the skirt is short enough that it doesn't. Okay, this one here is the only one. See how this is right here? It's the only one that interferes with. So this one, I would probably take and trim it just a little bit more so that it is right above. And I'm going to show you. Just a little bit above. I'm not trying to go crazy on this, okay? All I'm trying to do is get it just a little bit above that trailer right there. That's all I'm doing. Now I'm not going to sit there and go through every one of my jigs and do that to them. Why? Because every one of my jigs, I don't need it trimmed that much. Sometimes it's okay to leave that skirt like it is, because like I said, with that Rage Menace, it's not interfering with a thing. But this one, it is. So instead of going through all your jigs right off the bat and trimming them, you may only want to trim the ones that you actually are going to use or you need. Maybe take your pair of scissors and put them in your jig box, a little small pair, so that you just trim them if you need them. Why? Because we'll trim this one just a hair more. Why? Because like I said, you don't always have to do that, okay? It's not necessary to do it every one of them. All right, something else that we're going to talk about. That head design right there. See how it's arrow shaped? It's pointed like that. Okay, see how it has that little thing at the top? See how it kind of sticks out? You can see it a little better right here. It kind of sticks out that way. Guess what? That little arrow shaped head right there is more important for coming through trees, grass. It's not necessarily the best for rocks, but this is what I was telling you about why you don't need very many of these. Very rarely are you going to take this jig right here and drag it like you would a football jig or a ball head jig. Most of the times this is going to be a cast, retrieve, cast. Sometimes you'll see me cast these jigs out like a regular jig, and you'll see me bouncing my rod, working it back to me. Why? Because what I'm doing is I'm swimming it like this in little spurts. So I'm bringing it in little spurts through the water, and then they nail it. Okay, because they see it as a bait fish struggling. It's not steadily just coming. It's kind of jumping along is what it's doing. It's doing this in the water. They'll come up and they'll grab it. Okay, or all of a sudden I'll just start reeling it back to me. Like the other day, I'll just burn it back to me, and next thing you know, one came out and smacked it and grabbed it. Sometimes that's the way they want it. Sometimes I've taken a swim jig and I've thrown them out over top of grass flat that you could see grass on both sides, and there was like a little channel in between the grass bed, and I'd sit there and throw it out just like a spinner bait, hold my rod tip up and just sit there and reel it back to me. and those bass would shoot out of that grass and grab that swim jig, and they'd have it pretty far down in their throat. Next thing you know, you've hooked them, you got them out. And you say, well, in those instances, I want to trim my weed guard down. No, you don't. You want to leave your weed guard just like it is, I'm telling you. You say, well, why? And it's because that weed guard right there keeps you from that weeds balling up on your jig. This right here is what you hear somebody else say all the time. And don't get me wrong, this is a very true statement. You see the distance that there is on this weed guard right here from up top? Okay, that is true that you want this distance the least possible from this guard to the hook. Definitely a true statement. But here's the problem. That all depends on what type of weed guard you have. See this jig right here? You look at this jig right here. This is one company's version of a swim jig. You say, well, man, that's a good looking swim jig. It looks just like a bluegill. Okay, let's examine it and let's talk about the same things we always talk about. Look at the hook. Nice, stout, strong hook. It's not going nowhere. Keeper on it, it's pretty good. I'll show you something else about this Strike King keeper that's pretty neat. Strike King, or this jig here, this hook's awesome keeper, just a regular little part of the lead. Slip it on, holds the plastic just fine. We've been doing it that way for years. Okay. You see this little head right here? You look at the head of the jig and you think, oh man, that's buried in there. That'd be awesome too. It's not. Why is it not? Because look at the head of this. Might as well be a round ball. You know what that does when you cast it into grass? I wind up with a bigger ball of grass wrapped right around it. You know why? Because that head is awful. That should never be called a swim jig. That right there might as well be a ball-headed jig that you drag through on the rocks. That's how wide, and it's just got a rounded head to it. That's all it does. That shouldn't even be called a swim jig. Okay? Now, here's the other thing. You say, well, but look at those big eyeballs that has on it. Care less. Bass could care less. They don't care that it has big eyeballs. How many crankbaits have you seen people throw that the eyeballs, it knocks them out of, and they still nail them? You know why? Because they're not focused on the eyeballs. They're just not. Those catch fishermen, they don't catch fish. I'm just telling you. Okay, that's coming by them so fast. It's bouncing off of things. They think it's alive, they go hit it. They're not looking at the eyeballs in it. Here's the problem though. You see this? You say, man, that is awesome though. Look at how close that is. That'll get awesome hook sets. You know what the problem is? When I throw this thing right here into brush and trees, like I told you I like to throw this a lot, here's what happens. I'm barely even putting any pressure on this. The hook's already there. You say, well, isn't that what you want? If I was in open water, sure. But if I'm in a tree, if I throw this in a tree stump, if I throw this in bushes and grass and have to sit there and pop it loose, this right here, all it's going to do is just hang up in the wood and hang up in the grass. To me, this right here, waste of money for a swim jig. Why? Because it's too soft. This weed guard here is way too soft. It's so close. Now, if it was further back, I would be more impressed. But it's been so close to that jig hook that all I have to do is barely breathe on it and it's done hooked. This is an open water jig. That's the only place you can use this. If I was to throw this back in the cover that I usually throw my swim jigs and reel them back out of them and hop them and pop them out of, I'd spend more time hanging up than I would anything else. Here's what I was going to tell you about that Strike King. So this is something interesting about this Strike King that it just surprised me. Okay, very unique hook keeper. Stout hook. No keeper right here aluminum wise to put this on. Instead, what it has is this little wire. So when you thread your bait up on it, I'll show you one of these. When you thread your bait up on it, okay, that little metal piece sticks down in. See if I can show this. Could if I didn't have all this skirt on here. Okay, so once you thread this up on it, okay, you push it, that little wire keeper, right there, sticks in the plastic. Right there. Sticks in the plastic. See how that does? And holds that plastic in place. Why does that become so important? I'm gonna tell you why that becomes so important. Because when I take these little baits right here, and like I was telling you, I skip them underneath the docks, skip them all the way back in those bushes, I still haven't yet had one of these come loose. I didn't have to super glue it. I didn't have to do anything to this little jig right here. It stays in place. So when I skip it somewhere, I throw it deep in those bushes, it stays where it's supposed to stay. So to me, this is the type of swim jigs that I want. And for less than $5 to get one of these, I understand that not everybody's going to go out and spend $10. Strike King doesn't sponsor me. I know that a lot of people make a lot of good jigs out there, but I'm going to tell you something. I like making my own finesse jigs, and I've made my own regular jigs, and I've even made my own swim jigs. But when you put all the little things together that this little jig has, I'm okay with going and spending less than $5 to get 4 or 5 of these. So now for about 25 bucks, I got 5 of them. And I'll just put them in the boat and I'll just use them. Because like I said, most of the time I'm fishing these 15 feet or less. Most of the time I'm reeling them back to me. If I do get hung up, most of the time it's a log or a bunch of logs I've thrown it into, or it's in grass. I can take my boat right over there and pull it out. Hang these up very few times. I've wrapped them around trees casting more than I ever have thrown them into bushes and got them actually hung up. I've caught plenty of fish with them already this year since I've been using them. So to me, that's what I look for in a swim jig. I know it's a little long. I'll make another little video here soon about the different trailers and stuff that I've used or I've been using on them, but I figured I would just take a few minutes and just talk to you for just a little bit about the swim jig that I'm using and the features that I'm looking for in a swim jig and the features that this jig has. So anyway, I hope those help you. I hope it encourages you to go out. Thank you everybody that watches the videos. Thank you for sharing the videos. God bless you all. Don't forget, Jesus loves you. Y'all have a good day.